So the first thing I want to ask you is in the stream, you said something to the effect of Jordan Peterson is the dumb person's idea of a smart person.
Yes.
And I will say, I am not above saying things like that for people I disagree with. I think I called the people who were justifying like burning down businesses during like the Black Lives Matter riots. I said psychopathic scumbags. So I'm not above that, but I do think it is. It's not helpful in the long run. So my first question is, what did you mean by that? And do you think saying something like that sort of undermines the legitimate, more rational critiques you have?
So do you remember? Because I clarified immediately after I said that about what I meant. Do you remember what my clarification
Yeah,
was?
you said it doesn't. You don't think that the people listening to him are dumb or that he's dumb. And then what was the rest of it?
Yeah. Yeah. So the rest of it was what I mean by a dumb person's idea of a smart person is that the way he speaks and the way he presents himself comes across like in many cases at least, comes across like he's saying something profound and insightful, when in fact often he is just sort of rambling and not really actually conveying that much of substance. So it gives the appearance of insight and intellect behind what he's saying, but the substance is often lacking. So that's what I mean by the dumb person
Sure,
idea of a smart person, because they can't necessarily distinguish the rhetoric from the substance.
sure, but you do understand when you say like just the name a dumb person's idea of a smart person. It's like doesn't that even if you qualify it the way you do, doesn't that kind of like I get like I do videos explaining some of the more complex ideas, and I get emails from people saying like, hey, Peterson, he talks in these over intellectualized terms a lot. I don't always understand it, but if you break it down, it makes it more understandable. And just the name dumb person's idea of a smart person, it's kind of like I equate it to like abolishing the police or defunding the police. It's like, well, we don't really mean abolish. We're saying abolish the police or we're saying defund the police, but we don't really mean it. And
Well,
I don't want to
I
get hung
guess
up
that's
too
where
much
it's
on this,
different
but this is just
I
my perspective on
yeah, yeah.
kind of how you say it.
Look, like it's provocative. That's why I said it that way. But I really do mean that. Like, I really do mean to say that for people who cannot distinguish between rhetoric that sounds smart and actual intellectual substance, then that is that's what I'm referring to in when I'm criticizing Peterson for portraying himself that way. So it's
Sure.
not. It's not like I don't mean that. I do mean that, but I don't mean the implication that one might draw that I think either Peterson is dumb or his followers are dumb. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that the way he presents himself and the types of ways he makes his arguments are don't allow people readily or are not easily distinguishable from like someone who's actually making a profound point to someone who's just sort of rambling. So
Sure.
that's my way of
Fair,
articulating that.
yes. No, fair enough. And I think the substance of the disagreement is whether or not it's a lot of rambling and word salad. Because, again, I get, for someone who's like an atheist and genuinely considers their worldview with great detail, for someone like Jordan Peterson to come along and say, well, actually, buddy, bucko, you're not really an atheist. So, da-da-da. It's like, I get that. It's kind of a douchey thing to say. And I want to kind of unpack some of that. But I hear often he's accused of word salad. He's accused of rambling or whatever, making bad points. And maybe we can just go into one specifically, which is the postmodern
Sure.
Neomarxism one.
Yeah.
So, I have a minor in gender studies. I studied,
Oh, cool.
the what would you say? The think tanks of a lot of the progressive ideology, and whether you can call it postmodern Neo-Marxist, that's what we'll discuss. But I don't see the issue with a term like postmodern neo-Marxism. I think it's a useful term. My issue, people have. I think the primary objection is, well, postmodernism and neo-Marxism, or just Marxism, whatever, are incompatible with each other, and so using it is wrong in and of itself. They have their own technical definitions, so using it, is just disingenuous or something. But for me, the way that I view it is a term like postmodern neo-Marxism, it's a descriptive label, right, that you would apply to someone who is spitting out a certain set of ideas. And I think Peterson tweeted recently, and he gave a list of people. So Robin DiAngelo, Ibram X. Kendi, Kimberly Crenshaw, a couple other people. And so for me, it's like, I have no problem with that term. I think it's a useful term, despite the fact that there's sort of contradiction within it. The point is the reason the ideas that come out of postmodern neo-Marxism are bad ideas is because they're inherently contradictory. So what are your thoughts on that? And maybe just the term more broadly.
Sure. Well, we discussed this in the 10-hour stream that we did,
Right.
including the list that you mentioned. Although, unless there's another list that he tweeted, but I assume it's probably the same one you're referring to. Yeah. So the concern is, I mean, I in that stream I actually said that there is some utility in that term, but basically I think that we should regard it as a technical phrase to refer to broadly sort of left-wing progressive intellectual currents that Peterson doesn't like, and that's effectively the referent of that term. That there's no other real
Sure.
commonalities behind it.
Fair.
So if that's the way we're using it, then I think it's actually kind of handy. But there aren't really many other shared intellectual currents behind what behind what all of these different people think. Now there maybe are terms that one could use, and I think I mentioned in the video that one you could use is critical theory, which is a very broad category that does encompass things. You can put things like neo-Marxism, postmodernism in there, but there's not a lot of commonality behind it. They're generally critical of like liberal capitalist institutions and also our ways of sort of thinking, sort of a bit reactionary to Enlightenment rationalism kind of thing. So, look, I think that there are certain commonalities, but they're very general, and I don't think that Peterson is helping himself by inventing basically a new term that no one else really knows what he means by that. Unless he really just wants to use that as a label for people he doesn't like, then, well, I guess he can do that. It's a little bit like the term neoliberalism, actually, which historically has been used in academia. If you studied gender studies, you would have encountered this, right?
A lot of
to just refer to
neoliberal
kind of
it's a slur.
Anyone. Yeah, well, it refers to essentially anyone kind of right of center who says anything about capitalism that critical theorists don't like, effectively. Like, it's extremely broad and not a helpful term, and it's been criticized in the academy for exactly that reason. I would say postmodern neo-Marxism is a similar term of derision that's used in a very broad way to refer to kind of people with in intellectual currents that I don't like.
Sure. Well, I think you're underselling that when you say intellectual currents that you don't like. It's not that simple, because I think
or disagree with.
Right, but the reason you don't like and you disagree with them is because they genuinely they conflict with reality. So, like, if we were to say postmodern neo-Marxism is a term that Peterson uses to label a specific sort of mindset or worldview that spits out ideas that conflict with reality and thus are bad, I don't see an issue with it, because like, again, it's probably the most common criticism I hear is, well, he uses these terms like postmodern neo-Marxism, and it's kind of like describing someone as racist. It's like someone doesn't have to self-identify as racist for it to be an accurate description, to say that someone is racist, right? It's like we're describing their behavior and whether or not they happen to personally identify with that. And so whether or not there are intellectuals that would describe themselves as postmodern neo-Marxist, I suspect there are very few, because it's Peterson's the one that popularized it. You know what I'm saying? I can't believe I can't get it on the third time. So no one would want to fit into the framework he created. But, like, Kimberly Crenshaw kind of runs away from the term critical theory and critical race theory, right? It's the same idea of like, well, critical theory isn't really being taught, but it's a great theory because it just is criticism of racism and stuff. So to me, it's useful because it does encapsulate the two perspectives that I do think goes into a lot of ideas that I regard as bad ideas. I don't know what your perspective is on critical race theory or intersectionality. I regard those as, I'm taking sort of for granted they're bad ideas, intersectionality. In intersectionality, Kimberly Crenshaw explicitly says that it's based off of postmodernism. She's trying to fuse postmodernism with contemporary politics. And so postmodern neo-Marxism is an accurate description because it does bring in the postmodernism, which a lot of the postmodern neo-Marxists self-describe as bringing into their philosophy. And it is accurate to, contextualize with Marxism, given how much of it is, anti-capitalist and predicated on sort of the historical materialist conception of power dynamics underpinning everything. So I think I want to go into detail on that, or if you disagree, because I regard it as a very useful term.
Yes.
I just am not convinced that it's not.
We discussed a lot of these points in the video. So the fact that something is anti-capitalist, as many of these thinkers are, doesn't make it Marxist.
Sure,
Marxism is a very specific doctrine, or I guess set of doctrines, but still from a particular historical intellectual tradition that is anti-capitalist. So to say that something is Marxist because it's anti-capitalist, I think is just a mistake.
Fair enough.
Also, to say that postmodern thought or people influenced by it are are based on historical materialism, I also think is a mistake because many of them reject that framework. In fact, that was one of the original points of postmodern thinkers, is to reject this kind of systematizing grand worldview construction that Marxists sort of are famous for, that is characteristic of Marxism. That's the historical materialism, the clash of the classes based on the economic base and all of that sort of stuff. They're rejecting that. They're reacting against that. So to say that it's the same because they're kind of still anti-capitalist, I just think, well, what's the point of that? Why not just say postmodernists and neo-Marxists and intersectional? Why not just mention a few of the theories that you disagree with or want to speak out against, which is fine, right? Instead of concocting this new term that doesn't seem to refer to anything coherent other than the people you disagree with. Like, I don't see why not just use existing terms that actually have a referent.
Yeah, well, so to your point about that, just because something's anti-capitalist, we shouldn't call it Marxist.
Doesn't make it Marxist.
I agree. Yeah,
yes.
Fair enough. I should be more precise than that. I guess, how would I say it? So, like in my experience in gender studies, the postmodernism. Well, maybe I should just specify the claim. Like there are people. I disagree that these terms have referents that are universally agreed on to begin with. Postmodernism, I think anything in the philosophical domain, like there are people who regard the analytic versus continental distinction of philosophy as non-existent, right? Mm. And it's like, okay, well, language is about how useful the term is, right? Whether or not a term is a good term is how useful it is. That's really the only criteria I would put to it. And so there are people who say Foucault is not even a postmodernist, and it's like, okay, well, that fits well within the postmodernist narrative framework because words are all just power games anyway, essentially. But like the fundamental claim, you say postmodernists reject the Marxist framework. It's like, well, like a Foucauldian postmodernist would claim that power is the fundamental organizing principle of reality. I think that's fair to say. I think the term is power is that which acts upon actions, and so it conditions all relationships. This conversation would be a power game. The institutions in every government are predicated on power. Isn't that a meta narrative in and of itself? Doesn't that describe broadly reality itself?
Well, see, I'm not a Foucauldian scholar. I did study him, so I can only speak to the extent to which I understand. I think that Foucault would reject that characterization because I think that I mean, you can advance this as a criticism, right? That they're often vague on what they are claiming. What they'll do is they'll analyze something through a particular frame. But then if you ask them, well, like, does that, is everything just a power dynamic? I don't think they would actually claim that. They're typically, like, Foucault was interested in doing his genealogical historical analysis, right, of some particular concept or institution. So I don't think that he was really, and postmodern scholars are typically in the business of making claims like, everything is just power dynamics. But they do use that to analyze pretty much everything. So, but right. I mean, the question is, okay, let's suppose they are making that claim. I don't know that they would self-identify as claiming that.
I don't think
let's
that's
just say that they are.
So yeah,
But so what follows from that? Like, it doesn't follow that therefore they're making the same claim as Marxists, because Marxists are making a very specific claim about the way that society is structured. The way the society is structured is based on the economic base, and that in turn is based on a clash between the interest of classes. Like, that's a very specific characterization that postmodernists don't typically hold to.
To me,
so how can you say that they're advocating the same thing just because they're both different power analysis of power? Like, liberals have an analysis of power as well. It's different, right? But that doesn't mean that they're Marxists just because they think that the power dynamics in society are also important. They have a particular idea about the relationship between the state and individuals within it, and the contractual theories of governance and so forth. That's a power analysis as well.
Sure. I think Marx said something to the effect of, like, all ideas, all of the dominant ruling class ideas, religion, traditions, everything is built upon dominant material relationships. That's his claim, right? Yeah. That's sort of the dialectical materialism in a nutshell, right? It's all fundamentally material, dominant versus subordinate relationships. I don't interpret that, and maybe you give me your thoughts on it. How is that not essentially the claim of Foucault, or the idea that power is the organizing principle, right? It's like if all ideas, religion itself, everything is a result of dominant versus subordinate material relationships between not just people and classes, but like ideas themselves. Discourse is in and of itself a production of dominant versus subordinate material relationships. It's the same idea. To me, that's exactly what Foucault seems to be saying when it's, power produces discourse, right? You produce the category and then the category produces the discourse around it. It's like, it's the same idea that power, and again, it's like, well, what is, define power? And we get into the regression of the axioms.
Talking about that, right? But I don't really see how it's the same thing. So Marx is saying that essentially everything else in society, the superstructure, if I recall, which is like religion and political discourse and all that stuff, it's based on the economic base, which is the economic system, like whether that's feudalism or slave societies, feudalism, capitalism, and then ultimately socialism and into communism, right? That power dynamic determines everything else, according to Marx. That's why it's historical determinist, right? Because this idea, at least initially, was that every society progresses through these same stages, and everything at the superstructure is determined by the economic base, and the economic base is dominated by the clash of classes, like the serf and the lord in the feudal dynamic, or in capitalism, it's the capitalist and the worker, and the culmination of history will be the overthrow of the capitalists by the workers and the achievement of a classless society, right? Marx believed that was going to happen. It was inevitable. It's just that revolutionary activists could maybe accelerate it or help it along. And there was even dispute about that. But anyway, the point is that everything that I just said about that theory of society and the base and superstructure, postmodernists typically don't accept any of that, right? That is a particular Marxist analysis. Dialectical materialism, which is the Marxist doctrine, they don't accept that. Yes, they do analyze society power structures, but again, Marxism, dialectical materialism, is a very specific analysis of power structures in society. Just because you analyze things through power structures doesn't mean that you accept a very specific theory of that, which is what dialectical materialism is.
But let's take the claim that that power produces discourse. That's Foucault says that, right? Power produces discourse, and the idea is whoever's in charge kind of gets to produce knowledge and disseminate their worldview as the objectively true worldview. So the church, because they had the power, which they had the power, they then got to say what was true or not. That that's very simplistically a simplistic kind of analysis of that. Marx said the exact same thing, which is, and you're correct, and the superstructure is built on the economic base. But he said specifically, the ideas of the ruling class, everything, religion, all aesthetics, everything is fundamentally about who has the dominant material conditions. To me, that's exactly what Foucault is saying, in that...
That's not what he's saying. Foucault talks about discourses and how power is structured and reproduced through discourses.
Right.
Marx didn't say anything about that.
Yes. Yeah.
Marx wasn't talking about that. He was talking about the way in which the superstructure is produced by the base and the clash of classes there. I don't see that in Foucault. That's not what Foucault thought.
Let me
just because they both thought that, for example, religion is about. I mean, who doesn't think that religious structures are about power dynamics? Like, everyone agrees on that.
No.
There would just be a different analysis.
No, not at all. So
you're saying that. What it seems that you're doing to me is that you're looking at superficial similarities between them and then saying that, well, they're just the same thing. But they're not the same thing. Like, just in terms of, scholars in these disciplines have spent decades arguing between each other about their conceptions of power and things.
Sure.
So to say that they're the same thing just seems silly to me, that they're just not.
Well, I would say they're very similar, and for the reasons I gave. Let me.
Well, you can group them under critical theories. That's what I said before. There are certain family resemblances, is the term I would use, which is fine. But to make up a new term and then say that, well, they're basically all just part and parcel of the same thing, postmodern Neomarxism, I don't really see the point in that.
Okay, fair enough. So all right, so let me ask you this. So if Peterson, instead of saying the term postmodern neo-Marxist, if he used the term critical theorist, just in a one-to-one replacement.
Critical theorists, yeah.
You'd be okay with that?
Or critical theory.
You wouldn't have an issue?
Broadly, I think so, yes. So there is one caveat that I would levy, which is that the list that he mentioned of people, I don't know all of those people. Many of them, I think it would be fine to call them as critical theorists or activists influenced by critical theory. Maybe there are some for whom that would not be appropriate, so I'd have to check. Because just because you're progressive doesn't mean you're...
I agree. Bernie Sanders is not a postmodern neo-Marxist, I guarantee you that.
Yeah. So I don't want to speak for all of the times when Peterson has used that term. But what I would say is, in general, it seems that critical theory or critical theorists would be an appropriate replacement for many of the things that he's trying to say with the term postmodern neo-Marxist.
Okay, and fair enough. And So I guess what is, and we can move on to something else after this, but what do you think the harm specifically is? Because that to me seems like a minor semantic criticism that doesn't undermine his
for most
project,
people who
so to
don't
speak.
know the terms, maybe it doesn't make that much of a difference. But I think that there are many. Okay, well, so I mean, I value clarity and precision of language
Sure.
and
As
helping
do I.
people to seek truth, which I assume you do as well, right?
Yes.
So for a start, if I'm going to refer to someone, I want to refer to and their beliefs. I want to use a term that they would at least, well, maybe, I mean, because Foucault didn't like postmodernism, right? So, but
Right.
sometimes people just don't like any label. So,
Exactly.
it's a bit of give and take. But I would say that you should err on the side of trying to use a label that's more accepted and more widely used, and that they would be more likely to be happy with rather than one that is less. So when you basically just make up a term, that's unlikely to be good. I mean, sometimes you need to, right? But then I think you need to justify that. When there's already a label that's available, I can Google it, I can look it up. Like, what's critical theories? What's Peterson talking about here? I can then look up and maybe read it from their side. Whereas if you use a term like postmodern Neo-Marxist, where if I look up that on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, it's not going to be there because it's not an established term. If I look that up
Sure.
on Wikipedia, it's not there,
Okay.
right? And so it's a bit harder for me to access that. No, because you can look up postmodernism and neo-Marxism; those are things, right? So, but I think that it sort of to me is undermotivated to use a new term, and also I think that there's an additional risk of sort of straw manning when you're not even using a term that's sort of standard for your opponents. I would levy a similar criticism about, and I have before, about academics who have used neoliberalism instead of using terms that people who espouse those doctrines themselves would be more
Sure.
happy with, perhaps like classical liberal or libertarian
Or like
whatever it is,
Austrian
depending on the
economic
case.
or whatever they have.
Yeah, that would be another one,
inside of,
right?
Yeah.
And so, this is not specific to Peterson. I'm critical generally of use of these made-up terms that are pretty much only used as a pejorative term and are not otherwise deployed by people who support them. Now, neoliberalism is a much older term, so it is sort of used a bit now, and it's been better characterized. But I'm still generally critical of it, and I would say that the term postmodern neo-Marxism is similarly. Problematic because it's A, just sort of less clear and harder to find information about, and B, it's easier to, I think, sort of strawman or misrepresent a position when you sort of are making up a derogatory term for it instead of trying to use their own terms, or at least similar terms than would be to which they would use to describe themselves.
Sure. Yeah. And fair enough. And I guess just my response and pushback to that would be, I don't think any philosophical term is clear at all. Like I said, analytical versus continental. To me, I'm not a.
Well, there are degrees of clarity, right? Like I can look
Sure.
up those things on Stanford Encyclopedia or Wikipedia,
Right, but
and we'll learn about them.
but then
Postmodern neo-Marxism,
it's subjective.
no one else uses that.
Right. Like. Sure.
What I just said is not subjective. That's an objective fact that one term is widely used in academia, or a number of terms. Postmodern neo-Marxism isn't, right? So when I'm trying to work out what do people mean by this? What's the conception of it? One is easy to find information about. The other is not.
Well, I don't think so. Because hold on, isn't the analytic versus continental divide in philosophy? That's sort of like the most well known. It's like the highest, the broadest division.
Highest level distinction. Yeah.
Yeah. And some people say that doesn't even exist. So who's to say? So who's to say whether or not that's a good label at all?
Well, I don't
Who's
think that's
right
a very
on
good
that?
argument. I don't think that's a very good argument. So to say that
Well, it's
because
not an
something
argument,
is
it's just a
disputed,
question.
that therefore they, okay, sure. Well, who's to say who's right about it? Well, basically, we look at the arguments and evidences and we make up our mind based on who we think has the better arguments. That's how we decide any disputed claim.
Agreed.
Just because some people dispute it doesn't mean there's no fact of the
No,
matter.
I agree. My point is, though, that like the fact that you're pointing out that the way that we determine what is going to be true in that specific example, in a given example, is we have to sort of evaluate the arguments and compare them. It's like that involves a great deal of subjectivity, obviously.
Well, that's the situation we find ourselves in.
Sure, right. And I know, and I think kind of just getting into the weeds, and maybe I'm just being unnecessarily semantic here.
It's fine.
Because one of the important things I think too is, again, Peterson's speaking to a broad public. I don't think it's necessarily the only lens to look at is, well, within academia, terms like postmodernism, terms like Marxism, they have these technical meanings that are sort of widely accepted. Again, I agree with that to some degree because, like I said, people challenge that, and I just listened to a scholar who said that a scholar of Foucault who said that Foucault was not a postmodernist, and it's like, okay, well then, who knows what anything is at that point? So him speaking broadly to the public, again, the postmodern neo-Marxist label. And fair enough, I think we've.
Can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah,
Do
yeah,
you
go
think
ahead.
that the average Joe who Peterson is talking to knows what postmodern neo-Marxism is?
No, but that's why but I think it's
why is he
useful
using the term then?
because he
If most of his
explains
audience
it.
doesn't know what he's talking about.
Because postmodernism, most people know what postmodern art is, right? Postmodern art is actually a pretty clear touch point for a lot of people, right? You know,
That's true.
you shit in a bucket, and that has the same artistic value as the statue of David. And the idea being that, you know, the only reason that we say the statue of David has more value than someone who just shit in a bucket, and we say that's artistic and the other's not, is because, you know, who has power to determine whether or not the statue of David is a valid art, right? The statue of David is a Christian, or you know, it's rooted in Christian mythology, and so the reason we uphold it is just to uphold the superstructure, you know, in Marx's claim. So, you know, like that and postmodernism, certainly, again, certainly in my experience, you know, in gender studies, which is a specific example, but I've heard, you know, it permeates a lot. It's definitely a dominant strain of thinking. You know, and then Marxism is sort of the political manifestation of that. Okay, well, if everything is just sort of, if art and like gender roles, for example, are just constructed on, or are just sort of determined by who has power, well, the question is, well, what's the right thing to do? Well, it's to, you know, protect marginalized groups and all that.
The question was just about why Peterson uses the term, and obviously you're not, you know, you can't peer into his mind. But
I'm trying to explain my best why I think that term is useful, because
but let me just suggest that Peterson could have easily expressed the same idea in a way that would have been more intellectually reasonable and also just as clear to everyone that, like the average Joe he was talking to, by saying postmodernists and Marxists. Or neo-Marxists if he wants to, right? Like
maybe I think
way clearer,
fair enough,
and less problematic,
fair enough,
because those are two groups that he's responding to. It's throwing them together as if they're one thing.
But they do seem to alternate back and forth, like, and I think you pointed this out in the video. Is, you know, people draw from many different schools of thought.
Yes, people draw from multiple schools of thought. That doesn't make them one school of thought.
Well, yeah, fair enough. I guess it depends on what kind of prescriptions they offer, because it's sort of like, you know, one of the things that happened in gender studies was they talked about. Sorry, I don't know if. Can you hear me still?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, sorry.
That's fine.
I don't know why it went out. One of the things that happened in gender studies, we were talking about female genital mutilation and whether or not that was, whether or not it was fair. I said, yeah, it's a barbaric practice. That's a loaded term in a gender studies class. You know, barbaric.
I mean, it is a loaded term, barbaric, but yeah.
Well, but it's one. Would you agree with that?
The fact that it's loaded doesn't mean that it's not
appropriate
to call it that, but it is loaded.
Yes, definitely. But okay, fair enough. Maybe I shouldn't even have brought that up. I guess the issue is I was then, I was told, like, well, wait a second, because I occupy a colonial position of power, I am not in a position to criticize the practice of female genital mutilation. And it's like, to me, like, okay, hold on. From a Marxist perspective, I would think generally, we would say, well, actually, I don't know. Do you have any thought on what Marx would say about that? Because to me, it's like, well, that seems like oppression of the marginalized and, sort of the patriarchal community.
I don't pretend to speak for Marxists. However, Marxism is a universalist ideology, and it does have prescriptions about what a good society looks like. So typically, at least, Marxist regimes historically have not been shy about implementing their idea of a good society. And so Marxism is anti-colonialism, is anti-colonialist, but the idea of, for example, many Marxist regimes are actually quite good about promoting women's literacy and things like that. That's one thing that they did do. So I don't know about Marxist regimes dealing directly with female genital mutilation, but honestly, I tend to think that at least classically, many Marxists would have agreed that it's a barbaric practice that should be abolished, because they did that with other sort of traditional practices like that as well. They wanted to abolish the family and create a classless society where everyone's equal. Like that's. You could just make the same argument that, well, who are you to say that? That's a colonialist view. And this is my point, right? Because that's a different analysis of power than the Marxist gives.
Sure.
So they don't necessarily provide the same analysis of the power dynamic.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, and I think I'm doing a poor job of specifying specifically what, I guess, the fundamental issue. It seems in my experience like it goes back and forth between, they'll make postmodern arguments when it's convenient. Gender is a pure social construct.
There are people. I agree with that.
Right, and they'll make postmodern arguments when it's convenient, and they'll make Marxist arguments when it's convenient.
Yeah,
and I think
there are people who do that. I agree.
Right, and that's why you can say, they're postmodern neo-Marxist. Now, you're saying it would be better if you say postmodern and neo-Marxist. I imagine you'd get just as much flack either way.
Oh,
But if
maybe.
you want, do you have any?
That's hard to say.
That's fair. You have any last thoughts on this, and maybe
No, that's
moving on to
fine. I
religion?
think I've made the point that I wanted to make. I'm happy to move beyond
Yeah,
the terminological issues.
I know. Well, I
No,
want
that's
to
fine.
I want to get into another one. Hopefully, this is more productive because
Sure.
it's religion. So I'm working on a response to Rationality Rules criticism of Peterson in his claim that everyone is religious. I don't know if you've seen
Right.
that one. I think Peterson's
I can't remember.
Peterson's claim is that he says the fundamental axioms that guide your behavior is your religious belief system. And so therefore he asserts, because everyone is operating under fundamental claims, that's everyone is religious, so to speak.
Yeah.
Now, he again, going back to utility, I think we evaluate whether or not words are good based on their utility. And I think your point earlier was the postmodern neo-Marxist term is not useful because it lacks clarity, because there's already technical definitions established and they contradict. So, that provides less utility in and of itself. Fair enough. So I think that Peterson's conceptualization of religious is very useful. And the reason is because it seems to me that the most laudable and ethical goal that atheists have is to push back against religious fundamentalism and religious dogmatism. It seems to me, if there is anything that atheists do, or if there's any fundamental guiding purpose to the atheist perspective, that's a big part of it. Is that fair to say? I don't know. I'm sure maybe you or people have gotten. I don't know. Have you gotten emails from people about their horrible religious experiences and all that? And
Yeah. I've had a few people reach out to me specifically, but I've heard many other stories as well.
Yeah. So we both can agree that combating religious dogmatism is, I would argue, it's the most important outcome, because you could say well, we're interested in the pursuit of truth, but ultimately it's well, why do you care about the pursuit of truth? It's well, it's to reduce suffering, and the pursuit of truth inadvertently pushes back against religious dogmatism. So the reason I think Jordan Peterson's conception of religion is good in pushing back against religious dogmatism is because it encapsulates all forms of religious dogmatism that would normally fall outside of the purview of the traditional religious definition.
Right.
So fascism or nationalism, and also woke. I hate to call it this because the boomers have co-opted the term, but wokeism. Maybe postmodern neo-Marxism, but we won't use that. Let's say just wokeism to keep it broad.
Yeah.
But a lot like John McWhorter and a lot of people put forward the idea that wokeism is a religion. Fascism, certainly Nazism, drew upon all these religious archetypal kind of ideas. It seems to me that by conceptualizing religion more broadly, it's easier then to identify the religious dogmatism that exists outside of just purely the traditional religious frameworks. And maybe I can substantiate that more, but do you have any thoughts initially?
Yeah, so this is something that many other people have. Sorry, this is a point that other people have made before about conceptualizing religion more broadly than what we traditionally think of it as. And this is a really difficult point because even within the study of religion, it's very hotly disputed about what a religion is and what is characteristic of a religion. So, I mean, and part of the trouble is because essentially it's a word that was originally developed to describe a Western idea of what a religion is, like Christianity or a Christian church. And then we expand it to other things like, Islam, and then, Buddhism and Hinduism and things, sure, which themselves are quite different, but there are commonalities there. And then, okay, well, suppose we want to, what about Confucianism, which is more politically based, but maybe has some of the elements of religion, like Disagreement or Shintoism or something. And then what about something like Marxism, which is avowedly atheist, but then Buddhism is atheist as well, but they both have ideologies about how we should live. And so it does get quite murky. So if I'm going to say, no, this is a religion, or this is what religion is, that's hard to do because there is no hard and fast definition, and it is disputed. That being said, I personally dislike attempts to characterize religion as effectively any type of systematizing or any type of broad ideology. Or in fact, Peterson's going beyond that and saying it's really any type of fundamental beliefs you have, whether it's systematized or not. So that's even broader than Marxism or Nazism, which are these sort of ideologies. I guess at some point it's going to come down to how do you want to use the word. If you want to
Right.
use the word that way, then people will use the word that way. But for me, it doesn't promote conceptual clarity. I think we already have a word for, like we could just say fundamental beliefs, if that's what you, or values or something. If you want to talk about what a single person holds, if you want to talk about at level of systematized ideology, I'd use the word ideology, which includes something like Marxism as well as religions. I would I would prefer to preserve religion for something that does entail beliefs about, say, afterlife, supernatural gods, or at least sort of spiritual type entities. I know that's vague, right? But it's at least more constrained. So I wouldn't call Marxism or Nazism or wokeism religions, whereas I would say Buddhism, Hinduism, and Shintoism are religions. Confucianism is a tricky one. But because there can be vague cases or uncertain cases and still have a conceptual category. Like Wittgenstein made this point about games, right? Where it's like, what's a game? But
Yeah.
it's still, the word's still useful, right? So
Yeah.
that would be my preferred use of the language, and I would
That's a
defend
good
that
point.
based on, I feel like it's a little bit more precise and allows us a little bit more control. But that's not like, I can't say, well, it's never going to be helpful to use the word religion more broadly. So I don't want to be too dogmatic about that. I would push back against
Yeah,
broadening
fair
religion
enough.
because I feel like we have better words to do what you might want to do with that. But
Okay, well then maybe I can just I'll try my best to make the case and see if I can convince you.
sure.
So like there's a couple different pathways I can guess. So like let's go with 1940s fascism. So or maybe we could just use nationalism more broadly. So like the most extreme example of religious dogmatism, I think, is Islamic jihadism, right? And martyrdom, and essentially dying for your belief, right? If that's the worst element of dogmatism, and again, if the goal, if the fundamental goal is what is the best way to address, let's say, dogmatism more broad, or just fundamentalism of any kind, how do we want to conceptualize it? Your point is, well, we can just say dogmatism or fundamentalism or ideology. We don't need to call it religious. I think the value of calling it religious is like when you see like propaganda, for example, like fascist Nazi propaganda or communist propaganda for that matter. It draws on the same sort of religious themes. This is the idea of the archetypes, that like there's these sort of fundamental, what would you say, patterns of storytelling, and that all movies and all art to some degree draws on these archetypes, and that's what that's why people are interested in them. The classic Peterson example is the Lion King. Mufasa is the wise king, and then Scar is the evil king. It's the positive and negative aspect of culture, right? It's like the Nazi propaganda did exactly that. It portrayed everything as the Aryan race as these ancestral almost gods, right? Like this is our lineage. This is our these glorious people of our past. That is very religious. I see like on BitChute, like now modern alt-right propaganda, and it does the same thing. It takes these old pictures of white families or whatever, and it plays this nice music over it and all that. And it's like, I grew up pretty Christian. I grew up in going to church camp and all that stuff, and I prayed out loud every night, and so I was convinced of that. And then I realized that that's silly in my opinion, because Jesus never rose from the dead. That's my opinion. I still maintain that. But like, it's all like it seems to me it's all the same. It's similar enough that it makes sense to conceptualize it in the same way. I guess what are your thoughts on that? And then more specifically, what is the harm? Let's say it's less precise to conceptualize the religion versus ideology. Can you think of an obvious harm to that off the bat?
Yeah. So to the first question, I think that, again, I would prefer to just say that ideologies such as white nationalism or Nazism, or I mean even Marxism, draw upon religious themes or religious imagery, religious archetypes, rather than saying that they are religious themselves. That's how I would prefer to say it.
That's fair.
And in terms of what's the harm, well, that's what I was saying, that if it's understood the way you're using a term between the people in the conversation, there probably isn't a lot of harm. I think the issue is that if you start using the word religion or religious quite broadly, people will be liable to be a bit more confused or less clear about what you're saying, because that is a non-standard use. Generally, when someone says religion, just in a general context, you don't normally think of Marxism, I would say. You normally think of, like, if someone asks, what's your religion? If someone said Marxism, you're
Right.
like, oh,
Well, I know,
was
but
expecting you to say atheist,
yeah,
right?
but with
Now you might say, well, actually, there's a sense. But
there's
I would
definitely
say
some
that
Marxists that act religiously about it. That's for sure.
yeah, that's fair. That's fair, right? But the point is, in general context, if you look up religion, or if you look up like a census question about what your religion is, or if you get in that discussion, it's not standardly what people are referring to. Although, yes, if you establish a context in which, yeah, that's how I'm using it, you can get along fine. But I would say that we can. My contention would be, we can do everything you want to do with language and make the references you want to make using other words without having to expand the uses of religion in a way that can be confusing. But all that being said, I don't want to be too dogmatic about it, because,
Fair.
well, like I said,
Yeah,
at the end of
otherwise
the day,
you'd
if we
be
want to use
religious.
the word that
Yeah.
way, we can use the word
That's
that
fair.
way. Like, it's not.
That's fair. I think your point about, like, you acknowledge that like Nazism or Marxism or any ideology can draw on religious themes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then I think it's an open question of, okay, to what, like Peterson's perspective is, okay, to like how much, because drawing on versus it's fundamentally predicated on. I would say the whole psychological motivation of fascism was predicated on those themes. So the question is, okay, then if it's predicated on that, if it's predicated on religious themes, is it fair to call it religious? Maybe not.
Yeah, well, that's a discussion to have, right?
Yeah. So
in the characterization of religion.
Yeah. So okay, that's fair. Because again, because one thing I think I've heard is that like Peterson basically allows religious fundamentalists to have their cake and eat it too, right? He gets to come out as, ooh, there's this guy who's like super famous now and he's pro-religion, so he's basically defending religion. And like my conception was, well, people are upset that Peterson is defining religious so broadly because he's basically allowing fundamentalists to get away with their belief system. Do you think that? Do you think that, or is that something
Allowing
fair?
fundamental? Well, I don't know as much about what Peterson says about, like, fundamentalism per se. I don't recall him saying things explicitly about many of their. What he seems to do
He's
is
a very harsh critic about it. I think he says that they swallow a bunch of lies.
right.
He says, like, you can't deny evolution, because like one of my points is
Yes,
again,
well, that is one point.
right, and like one of the reasons I think Peterson is a net positive, especially in regards to combating religious fundamentalism, is like, look at all the religious fundamentalists who hear him talking about religion, he draws them in, and then he Trojan horses evolution in, right? It's like, you can't be a fundamentalist and believe in evolution, I think, sort of by definition. Maybe you can, I don't know, whatever, unless you're an evolutionist.
A lot of fundamentalists don't.
Right. Yeah. So I would say, hey, like, Peterson's doing a lot to combat exactly what a lot of atheists hate about religious fundamentalism, which is its denial of science and evolution. And to me, that's a net positive, and thus, again, I think kind of providing an argument for the utility of defining religion in that way.
Yeah, I mean, insofar as Peterson promotes evolution, then that's a good thing. I think that there are other harms that he does in terms of what he talks about, but I don't claim to be an expert. This is based on what I've heard him talk about.
Sure.
I think that one thing he does do is that he, and this is a lot more political. Like, I know that he's not aligned with conservative evangelicals and fundamentalists about a lot of the doctrinal stuff, right? Or scriptural interpretation. But he honestly, that in a lot of public discourse these days, it seems to be less about that and more about the culture war, particularly in the US, right? And in that sense, it's, well, are you on the conservative side or are you on the progressive side or something like that? And Peterson has placed himself in the position of being on the conservative side, even though a lot of what he says is not quite the way that it's not like, Jung is not really a conservative touch point, right? And so there's a lot of aspects that Peterson is a bit non-standard there. But the point is that he has placed himself on that side, and he does mention a lot of the conservative talking points. And that seems to be what's quite attractive to many people who listen to him.
Like what talking points specifically?
Oh, well, we talked about this on the 10-hour stream. So climate change would be a big one.
Sure.
Another one would be just general opposition to the postmodern Neomarxists, who are the same sort of people that the conservatives don't like. His views on, like, gender and transgenderism would be another one.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
his talk about the traditional family.
Sure. Okay. Let's. This is actually, I think.
Pro-capitalism would be another one.
Yes. So first off, I would agree that just by and large, is it fair to say that in the current political climate, Peterson, it leans towards the right? I would say yes. I don't think that's. He calls himself. He said in that one, he's like all of the right-wing psychologists are sitting in this chair, which is like it's a joke, but it's a half joke. Like he clearly is sort of leaning conservative.
Yeah.
I would say that's more or less just a function because in my opinion, the culture has moved very far left in terms of it's not the acceptance of like gender dysphoric people. It's the unabashed, uncritical way in which we say, hey, if a 12-year-old wants to get gender surgery or hormones, to even offer up opposition against that is to be against civil rights or something like that. That's really bad. I think there's plenty of reasons to believe that the culture by and large has moved left, at least in certain circles. So I would say a lot of people, including Peterson, are on the right from that perspective. And maybe just as an example, because this is actually something I wanted to bring up, and I didn't want to get too deep into that, but you brought up in the video, Peterson was upset about Trudeau outlawing conversion therapy.
Yes.
What can you clarify just what your thoughts were on that?
Well, I'm trying to remember the context of that. I remember he said something about
moral grandstanding.
You might remember more than me.
What
what was the context?
He tweeted Trudeau outlined conversion therapy, and he put it in quotes, is just more moral grandstanding. I think that was his tweet.
That's right. Yes, I remember that one. Yeah.
Do you have thoughts specifically on that, just to clarify? For people who haven't seen the stream?
Yeah, so it seemed to me that, so I think what I may have said and what I'd be inclined to say now is that's sort of what I was talking about, right? When I said that regardless of how Peterson self-identifies or other things, he makes a lot of points that are on the conservative side of the culture war. And this is certainly one of them, right? So when he says it's more moral grandstanding, I would say that's not a substantive engagement with the issue. That's just being critical of Trudeau.
Sure, fair enough.
It's fine
Twitter
to be critical
sucks.
of Trudeau.
Yeah, I hate.
It's not
the worst form of Jordan Peterson is Twitter Jordan Peterson. I'll agree with you on that. That's fair. That's fair.
It's not substantive engagement, and that's
agreed.
That's the sort of thing that I was referring to.
Okay, so so my broader issue is I fully agree with Peterson on this context because I think conversion therapy, which most people, when they hear conversion therapy, they think like pray the gay away camps, right? Sending a kid to a camp to turn away from gay. That is fucked up, and that should be illegal.
Yes.
That is not what Peterson and most people who have objections to Trudeau's ban have issue with. The way that conversion therapy was defined is that if you are a child and you say, let's say you're a boy, a biological male, a 12-year-old male, and you say, I feel like a woman, it is considered conversion therapy and therefore illegal for a therapist to tell the 12-year-old boy, you might not be a girl. This might just be a phase. That's why and to me that's insidious and disgusting and horrifying, and I think it's going to have horrible outcomes for children, detransitioners, and the like. I talk about that a lot, on my channel just because I think it's bad, and I do not think detransitioners are heard at all. And in fact, the Human Rights Campaign and other organizations that proclaim to be on behalf of marginalized communities will, dismiss their stories and all that. I'm obviously getting upset. My point is like that's an example of, I think every reasonable person should be upset that it is now illegal in Canada for a therapist to tell a 12-year-old boy that he may not actually be trans. And like that's not being on the conservative side other than, the culture has moved so far left that everyone who was in the middle is now conservative, right? So that's my issue with the political characterization of him as, well, he's conservative in that fundamental sense. And to your point, it doesn't seem like he actually is. It's just relative to where we are in the culture.
Well, yeah,
context.
So again, let me clarify. I wasn't making a claim about his fundamental politics or something. I mean, I find it confusing, some of the things that he says, sometimes to really pin him down. But
I agree. Many of the stuff is confusing, I'll admit.
The point that I was making is in the culture war, right? And so I phrased it deliberately in that way because in the culture war, it's often not less about what you say per se. It's who you appear to be supporting, right? And that's sort of consistent with what you were just saying before about, well, why might people who detransition not tend to be heard? Well, because listening to those, you have someone like that on, right? And you listen to them talk. What side are you on in the culture?
It could delegitimize, actual gender dysphoric people. Sure, I agree, but
and so I'm not saying that's right or that's how we should be pursuing discourse in society, but I am saying that I feel like that is a role that Peterson does play by many of the things he says.
Sure. Well, I don't think
when he says,
would it be fair to say that every single public figure, including you and I, does that as well?
Yeah, undeniably. The question though is that whether we play up that or whether we try to push back against that. And so let me then use this as a springboard to talk about the example that you mentioned. Okay, so because I think that there are many legitimate concerns about the way that, gay conversion therapy is defined legally. I'm concerned about that as well. I think that there's too broad definitions and that we need to distinguish abusive from non-abusive practices, right? Particularly when we're with respect to children. So
Sure.
I'm in agreement with a lot of what you said there. And we need to look at specifics and talk about that. But here's the issue. Peterson could have said something like that in his tweet. He could have said, these laws are too broad and will harm people, who are just confused, right?
You will not hear me support... I think Peterson should get off Twitter in general. Fair enough. He sucks.
I'm not asking
Twitter.
you to defend his tweet, right? But I'm trying to articulate the point I made about the culture wars.
Okay.
And even saying that, he would still be positioned in the culture wars, right? But saying that is, I think, a way to try to improve the discourse instead of just playing into the culture war side, which is like, this is just moral grandstanding, which seems to be just playing into that.
Fair enough, but perhaps he brought attention to a serious issue that I would not I would not have known about that. I would not have known that. Yeah. I would have thought conversion therapy was exactly how most people conceptualize it, which is, of course, fuck the gay, pray the gay away. That's fucked up. But certainly deny, a 12-year-old saying I'm a different sex than I really am, and saying like, actually, you maybe not. For that to be illegal, that gets into like, well, now cultural Marxism and all these extreme things. It's like that is about as extreme as it gets. Imagine if you had a child and the therapist could not tell your child that like you might not actually be the gender that you're saying, and then therefore if puberty blockers may be in the mix and all this stuff. It's like that to me is the scary part. There was one other thing politically. Fuck, can't remember. Conservative. I don't think I'm gonna be able to remember.
No, that's fine. I don't disagree. I think we need to talk about these issues as a society. We need to talk about them seriously and openly and thoughtfully. And we're not, right? It's just a shouting match most of the time, and that's a real problem. My concern is that I don't know how much Peterson is contributing to that sort of discussion. I'm not saying he never does, right? But certainly a lot of the comments that I've seen him make, I think, are not very substantive or helpful.
Would you agree with the statement? And this is a broad statement, obviously, and you can fair to say,
you
just
fine.
Don't know. But like, would you be comfortable saying that? Given I'm sure you would agree that like the positive mental health impact in the way he speaks about like practical psychology, have a goal, clean your room, all that shit. That's just good common sense, good advice. Like the fact that that's dispersed, throughout the culture more because of him. Would you agree that it's fair to say that Peterson is a net positive for society, or is that too difficult of a claim to make?
I mean, that's very hard to say, right? It's hard to say whether someone is a net positive or not, because that would require you to sort of know what the counterfactual is. I did say in that stream, and I'll say again, that it does seem to be the case that Peterson helps a lot of people improve their lives, particularly young men. I mean, yourself, you mentioned that you're one such person. Yeah, which is excellent. Now, do I think Peterson does harm? Yes. I think that he inflames culture wars by making tweets like that. How do I balance those things against each other? I honestly don't have the basis to say that he does. I would say I'd like to think that he does more good than harm. Maybe one way that I could justify that is to say that it seems that the people's lives who he impacts positively, he does so in quite a substantive way. Like yourself, for example, seeing therapy and changing life, and that's a big substantive impact. The people that it impacts negatively, like he pisses off a lot of people who probably wouldn't like him anyway. He muddies the waters a bit, which are already pretty muddied. So maybe that's less substantive. So, but I'd like to say that the positive outweighs the negative. I just don't actually know that I know how to evaluate that. And honestly, I'd say this about a lot of figures. It's not specific to Peterson. A lot of figures who I think let me give another example. Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins has done a lot good to promote knowledge about and discussion of evolution.
And combat fundamentalism. To the point earlier.
Yes. Yeah. But he's also said a lot of crazy things, and he's ignited a lot of controversy. So is he net positive? I'd like to say.
I would say definitely yes.
I
would say
I'm
for
not
sure.
exactly sure, right?
Yeah, I would. Yes.
Yeah, look, that's fine. Maybe I just assess these things differently. I'm being more cautious, right? But
maybe, and I'm probably exactly. I was gonna say I'm probably less precise and more willing to put my foot down. But that means I'm just probably less precise, and
But also,
stupider.
let me add to that. I'm less concerned. I mean, this might sound a little odd, but I'm less concerned about whether someone is a net positive or a net negative because that's so hard to assess, right? And I think our culture is actually a little obsessed with that. Like, you find out someone did blackface 20 years ago, and it's like, oh, they need to be cancelled.
Sure.
And everything good that they did is like somehow tainted, which I disagree with. They should be held accountable for bad things. But what we shouldn't be doing is trying to hold this ledger in our head of whether someone is like on the positive side or on the negative side. What we should do is promote the good and condemn the bad and try to promote the better and reduce the worst side of things. I don't know that this sort of ledgerism idea of are they net good or are they net bad is that helpful way of thinking about it. So I just don't really think about things that way. I mean, of course, there are clear cases. Yes, Hitler was net bad. Like Stalin was net
That's
bad.
good.
Like,
okay, fair enough.
obviously, there are clear cases, right? But in many cases, it's public figures are more complicated.
Sure, fair enough. And I think, just to reiterate the very criticism at the beginning, maybe we can wrap up here, is it seems to me that just how he's described, again, I know you clarified the dumb person's idea of a smart person. It's like the implication would be that he's a net negative. Maybe not just from you, and I think you're a lot more careful than, like, I think like Matt Dillahunty was like, he's like, Peterson's too much of a fucking narcissist to just, suffer through the withdrawal symptoms or something like that. And it's just like, to me, that's just like, okay, clearly he hates the guy.
Attack, right?
Right. So,
whereas what I said, I don't think that it's not.
Sorry, I'm not, and I don't want to. Yeah, I don't want to even put you in the same camp as Dillahunty in that.
No. I'm happy to defend what I said. That's intended to be a description of the way he talks and presents his ideas.
Sure,
because I
think
it's like
it's a little provocative.
That way.
Fair enough.
And it's a provocative way to say it, but yes. I do stand by what I say. I'm not asking you to agree, right? But
fair enough.
Yeah, but whereas saying that he's a narcissist or something like that, or a racist or just an arsehole, that's really just a personal insult. And I'm not, I'm not really into just personally insulting people.
Fair.
Even if I think they are an arsehole, it's usually not helpful to just.
I genuinely struggle with that. It's like, there is an element of like, isn't it like, is it ever a good idea to ridicule someone? And it's kind of like, my first instinct is no, but like sometimes I think like if an idea is so absurd, like we have to put some barrier around the conversation. Like if someone is genuinely saying like, well, I think murder should be legalized. It's like, I think that is better approached with mockery and ridicule, right? It should be sophisticated and funny, right? But like, and
should we mock the idea or the person who propounds it, or both?
Well, it depends. It's kind of like, well, if you and I are having a conversation about, hey, what policy should we put forward to improve the world, and like maybe we're politicians, I guess I'm not going to entertain a discussion with someone who's like, well, we should legalize murder. It's like at a certain point I have to exclude people, right? And I do struggle with that in terms of my thought is like, it's okay to ridicule someone and their idea only if you are 100% confident that if you sat down and had like an hour-long discussion and just discussed their idea, you're overwhelmingly confident that you could, take it apart, right? Like the murder being legalized thing. It's like, I've yet to have an hour-long conversation with someone who believes that, but I am quite overwhelmingly confident that I could, in good faith tear that apart. And then I can exclude
Let me just push back against that because I'm kind of interested here. So what about people who think abortion is murder? Right. From their perspective, lots of people think murder should be legalized. Right. So
yeah, I know that's I've had
maybe ridiculing everyone who disagrees with that.
Yes. No, I know that's certainly right. That's the issue, and it would be, can you clearly take it apart in an argument? That's sort of the criteria I was laying out. It's like, if you have a good faith discussion, and I've had debates about abortion. I'm pro-choice. Or I don't believe that the moment a sperm fertilizes an egg, that has the equivalent moral value of a human being. That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
In my opinion. But I'm not willing to say that people who believe that are, like stupid, like the people who believe like, no, if you want to kill someone, that should be illegal. Because I've in those discussions, there is a reasonable perspective. It's like, look, if you agree it's an arbitrary line at some point, because I don't believe like abortion should be allowed like 2 minutes before the procedure, right? If it's got a fully functioning nervous system and all that. So at some point there is an arbitrary line, and I do kind of draw it arbitrarily. It's like, well, when can the baby feel pain? It's 3 months in, something like that. And the pro-choice, the radical pro-choice perspective does have a valid argument of like, in order to be able to do that, you're drawing some level of subjective arbitrariness. And I agree. And so I'm like, look, I can't just ridicule you and say it's ridiculous because you have a valid point. My point, the point I always go to in abortion arguments is like, if a woman who took a Plan B pill, because some will consider Plan B the same as murder, right? Like genuine abortion. So I make the case of, if you're at dinner and you're talking to two women and one of them said, hey, when I was younger, I had a one night stand and I took a Plan B pill, or maybe I had an abortion like a week later or something. And then you're talking to another woman at the same table, and she says, "Hey, when I was younger, I drowned my 3-year-old in a bathtub." Like, if you regard those as the same person, like, it's, to me, that's laughable, right? And it speaks for itself that you don't actually believe those are the same thing. Now, some people will say, "No, I would regard them as the same thing," and it's like, well, sure, you would. I would question your judgment in that case.
It's interesting. So I think, I raised. I mean, we don't have to get into a long tangent about abortion. I mentioned that because it's one of the hot button issues that does have that same resonance as the whole murder thing, because some people do regard it as murder. But so I think it's a particularly difficult thing for our society to discuss, thoughtfully, especially these days. I think that, I think sort of extremist views on both sides of that are unhelpful. And I think I sort of agree with your sort of take about it being quite a tricky issue, and that they're being somewhere in the middle. But sorry, I was going to go somewhere else with that. Bugger, I lost my train of thought.
That's it.
Like you did.
That makes two of us.
Yeah. No, but I think the idea is that in order to have a conversation about these sort of things, there has to be a bare minimum of like good faith with respect to the other person, and the fact that they're trying to sort of grapple with the difficult issue. And I think that the some of the extremist rhetoric on either side, where it's like you just sort of hate women and don't want women to have any rights, versus
control women's bodies, versus
like you're just a murderer
babies.
and don't care about babies. Like, neither of those things I think are very reasonable or very fair. And I think that, sorry, this is the other thing I was going to say, that some of the extreme pro-life people, I really would like to have a chat with, because I don't think I've met anyone who's that extreme, where they're like, any form of abortion is murder and should be like regarded similarly in law, because I don't actually know what that looks like, because a very large fraction of women get abortions. And if you want to treat them all as murderers, like, how is that actually going to work socially? Like, maybe you even think that in some moral sense may be true, right? But like, do you want to implement that as a social policy? Because I don't know any society that's actually done that, even ones that have been like, so these sorts of questions, like, even if you think that it's morally clear, surely it's socially a very difficult question about how we deal with it, right? Unless you want to put like a third of women in prison for 20 years, like, so we have to have a thoughtful and reasoned discussion about this. But I mean, and I think that unfortunately we seem to be moving further away from that. So that's.
Right.
That's one concern I have about the ridicule side of it, to come back, because
fair enough.
I don't know. It seems there will be people who think that things that we think are morally horrific are defensible in some sense. And
I agree. Yeah, I mean, I'm not. Are you a vegan, out of curiosity?
Not a strict vegan, but I'm mostly vegan.
Okay,
but that's another example.
I know, and I really want to.
I'm not one of the crazy vegans. Sure. I don't like them either.
That's fair. I really want to talk to a vegan who does sort of vegan ethics and stuff, because that to me is like the most. That's the thing I think internally I struggle with the most, of like, I have a couple objections that I just genuinely haven't heard disputes on or disputes to. That doesn't mean they aren't there, which is why I want to talk to someone. But it's like, if those objections could be met, I really don't have any justification for not being vegan, right? Because it's like, I'm against factory farming. I don't. I think some people equate like animal life is not fundamentally different from human life. That, to me, there's some that's not the. Although it'd be interesting to talk to someone who has that perspective. But to your point, like the vegan, like I do think that's one of those things that like 50 years from now, it's like, I had a Chinese food today. I had pork fried rice, and I was just thinking, like, this is probably one of those pigs that they fucking tortured and shit. I've got no problem with, like ethically raised animals. And like when I go to the grocery store, I try and buy the more expensive eggs that are free range and all that shit, because it's like ethical consumerism and all that. But like, is that really enough if there's horrible factory farming going on? So that's, to your point, that's a legitimate point. I think those are the things I wanted to cover. I think I got one question at the end. That I want to ask, but I think what I've learned from, because I think I do have a sort of conceptualization of like, it's Jordan Peterson versus the atheist, right? It's Jordan Peterson versus Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson versus Dillahunty, and I think there's a lot more overlap, to your point, as we were discussing. It's not like his use of religion. It's not like in and of itself terrible. You just have to I just have to make a convincing case that it's useful, right? And then
we all have to be clear about the usage in a given context, and that's
sure.
A big part of the issue there.
Yeah. Right. Before I ask you, do you have anything you wanted to ask me at all as a Jordan Peterson acolyte?
So maybe just one question. carrying on from that point about the atheist, because I don't claim to be any particular expert about Peterson, but it does seem that he doesn't really like atheism, and he said some pretty negative things about atheists before, about like atheist morality and things like that.
Yes,
So,
he says you're not really an atheist, right? Or he says atheists would be evil, or they'd be like Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. But fortunately, he doesn't think that people are actually atheists.
Yeah. So I mean, is that what? So is what we're supposed to take from that someone who had no fundamental value would just be like a complete psychopath, but no one is actually like that, or effectively no one. So therefore, well, I don't know what follows from that.
Yeah.
Therefore, we should realize that we're not really atheists, or like what's he trying to get across when he says things like that? I guess.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to the definitional thing of like, if you accept that you have a fundamental system of axioms, whether or not you can articulate what those axioms are doesn't change the fact that you act by them. And it, like Freud said, and many other thinkers have said something to the effect of like, cultural ideals and gods are the same thing. Like money could be a god for many people. And like, I do like that analogy. I think like a good, I personally like, because I've known addicts, but like the idea of like a cocaine addict, cocaine being that person's god, and all of their action is predicated on that. It's kind of weird to be like, well, so what? Cocaine is your religion? It's like, I get that that's like, that clearly clashes with our current definition. And to your point, how does that help clarify? But like, when I'm examining their behavior versus the rationalizations that they spout off on how to get their drugs or whatever, or why they justified stealing, it feels the same way. And I think I need to do a better job of articulating and understanding it myself. But it feels very similar to how a religious ideologue would spout off their rationalizations, or a Marxist or something like that. That's why I think it's useful to conceptualize.
Yeah, I think psychologically there's commonalities there.
Yeah, but to your point about atheists, being immoral, I think the point is like, and this is a point I hear often is like, like Dillahunty will ask a Christian, so you're telling me if God didn't exist, you would just go around raping and murdering? And the implication being like, if you say yes, it's like, you're just lying, or and I think Dillahunty says the same thing. Like, he says, I've asked people that and they said yes, but I don't believe them, which is kind of what Jordan Peterson does, right? So it's kind of funny.
Yeah.
But like, I've thought about too, is just like, and again, having been in therapy, you go through a lot of, the darkest aspects of your life and all that shit, and the terrible traumatic stuff that you experience and think. And it's like, I don't think it is as obvious. Like, if I truly believed I could do anything and get away with it, I don't know how, I can't say honestly whether or not I would act in a psychopathic way, because in order for me to make that judgment, in order for me to conceptualize myself that way, I would have to step outside of the mechanism that I would use to make that judgment to begin with, right? It's like, who I am now is how I make judgments about whether or not I would be someone else. So it's kind of an impossible question. But I think the idea that Peterson kind of is putting forward is like, if you truly believe there was no objective moral, idea, or objective moral truths that you could get away with or not, then people would be tempted to act that way. And it's like, it's not, I don't think that's obvious, but I do understand that, and I'm sympathetic to that.
Yeah, look, I mean, there's something to say about that. I would be inclined to say that. So I think it was Piaget who looked at the levels of or stages of moral development in children. I mean, and of course his particular framework's been critiqued, but the point is that his framework, I think it was lowest or second lowest moral level of attainment, was basically like, you don't do something because if you do it, you'll be punished, or like some authority figure will sort of slap you down for that. And I would sort of say the same thing. If that's really the only reason why you act in a certain way is because you think that there's an authority figure, be that the government or ultimately like God or something, who will impart a negative consequence to you for doing that, that's a very low level of moral development. A higher level of moral development is internalizing certain universal ideas about how it's appropriate to treat other people, and that you actually want to do that because of your own internal motivation. That's a high level of moral development. Yeah. So I would say that doesn't depend on the existence of a God. I mean, I don't believe that anyone's I mean, humans and society can hold me accountable for some things, but no one can hold me accountable for everything because many things that they don't know, right? And so
Yeah.
that doesn't mean that I don't have that motivation, and many other people likewise behave that similar way. And I would say that if there are religious people who only behave in a certain way because they think that God's watching them, they're at a very low, I would say they're at a very low level of moral development, and they don't really fully understand the notion of morality. Or possibly they do, they just don't care. But
Sure.
that would be another point. But
Yeah.
at any rate, so I don't like this idea that morality is fundamentally about like carrots and sticks and a big guy kind of watching over you. I don't even know that that's
Sure.
what Christianity teaches, but that's another point. But
Fair enough.
There's a certain idea that people have in their mind.
Yeah. There's
It
a
doesn't sit well with how I think about morality.
That's fair. There's a quote from Pearson I like, is like, whether or not the gods are external or internal makes very little difference about whether or not they're gods. And the idea, and I think to your point is like, think about a cultural moral development. The God has to exist externally, and then it's ingrained in you so that you're being intrinsically motivated. That like there was.
Well, that's me though. That's not a god. Like that's
Well, I know. Well, I know. And again, like to the earlier point, like I don't believe that the Christian conception of God is accurate. Like I don't believe in a bearded man in the sky and Jesus and all that. Jesus was. I think Jesus was a historical figure. So It's not. I actually don't know fundamentally what I believe on a lot of things. I'm kind of a fucking
that's
idiot.
all right. That's
right. I know.
good to admit that.
I know. I have to. I act anyway. But yeah. So, okay. So just last question. I want to ask this anytime I'm having a discussion with someone. Take it however you want. In your opinion, what would you answer the question? What is the meaning of life?
Oh, I actually did a debate about this a little while ago. So, and I'm trying to remember what I defended. So, I think the meaning of life is to pursue objectively worthwhile projects in a way that's fulfilling to you. So, objectively worthwhile means it actually is valuable, because I think that there is things as objective value. But it needs to also be meaningful and fulfilling to you. So you can,
as an individual,
someone could pursue objective things, yes. So, but that's where the meaning side. Something could be good but not meaningful for you, and something could be meaningful to you but not good. So when you say meaning of life, I think that we've got both of those elements in it. At least I think that's a plausible conception. So yeah, to pursue objectively worthwhile projects or ends in a way that's meaningful to you is my one sentence.
Fair enough.
The thing is, though, that doesn't tell an individual how they should live, really.
No,
because they need to find those valuable things, and then work out a way to pursue them that's meaningful to them. So it's not, it's kind of like it's an answer, but it's not really a very helpful answer. And honestly, to a question like that, maybe that's the best we can hope for.
Fair enough.
I suppose maybe a Christian would say, well, to come to a relationship with God, and maybe that's a little bit more prescriptive.
Yeah.
But I mean,
or maybe
I don't think that's true.
Maybe that's the same thing, just put in a different term. It's like,
well,
who knows, right? I think I like it sounds it sounds like a pragmatic, objectively worthwhile. It's like there's an element of practicality to that that I think is good, and I think that's all. Cool. Well, James, I appreciate you coming on and challenging me and standing up to my challenges.
It's a pleasure.
Yes, whether or not they were effective or not.